A gruesome story leads off our newscast.
Milwaukee police found body parts in a north side apartment, and now they wonder if they've uncovered some kind of death factory. This was the scene earlier this morning. Police hired a private contractor to haul a refrigerator and a tank of acid out of the apartment in the 900 block of North 25th Street.
In my opinion, he appeared to me to be a geek. And by that I mean a guy that stays to himself and just do weird things.
Murderer Jeffrey Dahmer. Earlier this week, police discovered a grisly collection of skulls, torsos, and other body parts in a refrigerator and a large drum inside Dahmer's apartment.
In May 1991, Milwaukee police responded to what should have been an obvious emergency. A teenage boy was found wandering the street late at night. He was naked, visibly injured, and clearly disoriented. Witnesses immediately knew something was wrong and called for help. The boy was bleeding. He struggled to speak. He could barely explain where he had come from or why he was there. Neighbors stayed with him, trying to keep him safe while waiting for officers to arrive. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a child in serious distress. When police reached the scene, another man stepped forward. He calmly told officers that the boy was with him. He said it was a private situation. He claimed the boy had been drinking and needed to be taken home. His tone was relaxed. He appeared cooperative. That man was Jeffrey Dahmer. Officers spoke to him briefly. They did not separate the boy for questioning. They did not call medical services. They did not run a thorough background check. Instead, they accepted Dahmer's explanation at face value. Witnesses protested. They told police the boy was hurt and frightened. They begged them not to let him leave. Their concerns were ignored. Police escorted the teenager back to Dahmer's apartment. Within hours, the boy was dead. His name was Conrad Synthesamphone. He was 14 years old. This was not a crime hidden in darkness. This was not something discovered years later. This happened in public, in front of officers, with multiple chances to intervene. And every one of those chances was missed. Jeffrey Dahmer was not a mystery figure uncovered years later. By the early 1990s, authorities would identify him as a serial offender whose actions stretched back more than a decade. His activities spanned from the late 1970s until his arrest in 1991, during which time he managed to remain largely unnoticed. What made this case especially disturbing was not just what he did, but how ordinary his life appeared from the outside. Dahmer lived quietly, held short-term jobs, and moved through everyday spaces without drawing serious attention. There was nothing about his routine that immediately set off alarms. The individuals he targeted shared a common vulnerability. Most were young men who were socially isolated, struggling financially, or disconnected from strong support systems. Many were people society often overlooked, which made their disappearances less likely to trigger immediate concern. This pattern allowed Dahmer to operate without consistent scrutiny. When questions were raised, they were often dismissed as misunderstandings or isolated incidents. There was no early effort to connect the dots or recognize repetition. It is important to understand that during this period, law enforcement and social systems were not structured to identify long-term patterns quickly. Missing persons cases were often handled individually, without shared databases or coordinated follow-ups. By the time Dahmer was finally stopped in 1991, the scale of what had happened shocked the public. But the warning signs had existed for years. scattered across different moments and encounters that were never fully examined together. This case is not just about one individual. It is about how long-term harm can continue when patterns are ignored and vulnerable people remain unseen. Late at night in May 1991, Cohnrach's synthesophone managed to escape from Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. He ran into the street disoriented, injured, and unable to clearly explain what had happened to him. He was visibly distressed and struggling to stay upright. Two women nearby immediately realized something was wrong. They saw his condition, noticed that he was bleeding, and stayed with him while calling the police. To them, this was not a misunderstanding or a domestic issue. It was a clear emergency involving a child who needed protection. When officers arrived, Jeffrey Dahmer approached them calmly. His demeanor was relaxed, controlled, and cooperative. He did not appear nervous or aggressive. He spoke softly and confidently, presenting himself as someone who had nothing to hide. Dahmer explained that Cohnrach was with him and described the situation as a private matter. He claimed the boy was intoxicated and needed to be taken home. His explanation was simple, delivered without hesitation, and framed in a way that discouraged further questioning. What stood out later was Dahmer's body language. He remained composed throughout the interaction. He avoided confrontation, answered questions briefly, and did not challenge authority. His calmness worked in his favor. The officers, visibly uncomfortable, chose not to investigate further. Witnesses protested and urged them to take Cohnrach to a hospital. Those concerns were dismissed. The situation was treated as an inconvenience rather than a warning sign. Several factors influenced that decision. Authority bias played a role, as Dahmer presented himself as cooperative and reasonable. Discomfort with the situation, including assumptions about sexuality, also affected how seriously the officers treated the incident. Instead of separating the victim and investigating independently, police accepted Dahmer's explanation. They escorted Cohnrach back to the apartment, effectively placing him back into danger. That decision would later be recognized as one of the most serious failures in the case. Not because the warning signs were unclear, but because they were ignored. This moment locked the entire case in place. It showed how calm behavior, social discomfort, and misplaced trust can override obvious danger with irreversible consequences. Jeffrey Dahmer did not escape scrutiny because he was clever in a dramatic sense. He succeeded because he understood something far more basic: how authority reacts to calmness. In high-pressure situations, police are trained to assess threats quickly, and calm behavior is often mistaken for innocence. For more than a decade, Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes existed as fragments, isolated disappearances, unexplained absences, lives that quietly vanished without urgency. Each case appeared small on its own: a missing young man, a report filed late, a family that did not know where to look next. There was no single moment that demanded attention. That was the danger. From 1978 onward, Dahmer moved through different cities and apartments, leaving behind a trail that never seemed connected. Victims were often reported missing weeks or months after they were last seen. By then, leads were cold. Names were filed. Files were closed. The system treated each disappearance as an individual tragedy, not part of a growing pattern. What unified these cases was not obvious at first. Many victims came from unstable backgrounds. Some were estranged from family. Others were new to the city, living on the margins without strong networks that could demand answers. Their disappearances did not disrupt powerful communities. They did not generate immediate headlines. That invisibility became Dahmer's greatest protection. There were moments when alarms should have sounded: prior encounters with law enforcement, complaints from neighbors, witnesses who felt something was wrong but lacked proof. Each time, the response was fragmented. Incidents were handled as separate problems, not signals. The idea that a single individual could be responsible for repeated violence never fully took hold. This is how long-term offenders survive unnoticed. They rely on distance, not geographic distance, but institutional distance. Different precincts, different officers, different years, no shared memory, no shared urgency. Without a centralized way to track patterns, repetition becomes invisible. By the early 1990s, however, the gaps between cases began to close. The disappearances were no longer scattered far apart. The timeline tightened. Locations overlapped. Similar details resurfaced again and again. Investigators would later realize that the clues had always been there, just never placed side by side. The Conrack synthesophone incident was not the beginning of exposure. It was the moment the system lost its last excuse. By then, Dahmer had already committed multiple murders. The warning signs were no longer theoretical. They were physical, immediate, and undeniable. When the truth finally began to emerge, it did not arrive as a single revelation. It came as a collapse, files reopened, names re-examined, timelines redrawn. What once looked like unrelated tragedies suddenly aligned into a single, horrifying picture. Families who had waited years for answers learned that their loss had not been random. Investigators were forced to confront how long the pattern had existed, and how many opportunities had been missed to stop it earlier. This was the moment the narrative shifted. Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer an unknown man blending into the background. He was becoming something far more disturbing, proof that extreme violence can hide in plain sight when systems fail to see repetition as a warning. The pattern had always been there. It simply went ignored for too long. On the night of July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's control finally fractured. A man he had brought back to his Milwaukee apartment managed to escape, fleeing into the street with handcuffs still locked around one wrist. This time, the situation could not be reframed, softened, or dismissed. When police were called, the evidence was immediate and physical. Officers escorted the shaken victim back to Dahmer's apartment to retrieve the key. What happened next changed the course of the entire case. Inside the bedroom, an officer noticed a set of photographs lying in plain view. They were not ambiguous. They showed dismembered bodies, severed heads, and graphic scenes of violence. The images did not require interpretation. In that instant, the narrative collapsed. Dahmer was handcuffed and placed under arrest. The calm, cooperative demeanor he had relied on for years no longer mattered. Officers secured the apartment and called for backup. What they suspected was serious crime would soon be revealed as something far worse. As investigators began a systematic search of the apartment, the scale of the horror emerged piece by piece. Human remains were discovered in multiple forms, preserved organs, skeletal fragments, and body parts stored in containers. A refrigerator held severed heads. A freezer contained additional remains. Chemicals used for preservation were found throughout the space. The apartment was not chaotic. That detail disturbed investigators deeply. Everything had a place. Tools were organized. Containers were labeled. This was not evidence of panic or impulse. It was evidence of repetition and routine. Detectives quickly realized they were standing inside the center of a long-running crime scene. This was not a location tied to one incident. It was a workspace used over years. Each discovery expanded the timeline backward, forcing investigators to reconsider unsolved disappearances stretching more than a decade. Dahmer was taken in for questioning. At first, he offered minimal resistance. Then slowly, he began to speak. What followed was a series of confessions that stunned even veteran investigators. He described murders spanning multiple years. He provided names, dates, and locations. He explained methods without visible emotion. The confessions matched the physical evidence. When detectives checked his statements against missing persons reports, the connections became undeniable. Case after case aligned. Victims long assumed lost or forgotten were suddenly accounted for not through survival, but through confirmation of death. As word spread through the department, shock turned into urgency. The investigation expanded rapidly. Additional locations tied to Dahmer were searched. Evidence was cataloged. Forensic teams worked around the clock to identify remains and notify families. By the end of that first day, law enforcement understood they were dealing with one of the most severe serial crime cases in American history. What had begun as a single escape had unlocked a hidden archive of violence. Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest was not just the capture of a suspect. It was the moment an entire decade of unanswered disappearances began to speak. And what they revealed would soon horrify the entire country. Once Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest became public, the story moved faster than authorities could control. Within hours, news stations interrupted regular programming. By the next morning, his name was everywhere. What initially sounded like another violent crime quickly transformed into something far more disturbing, a revelation that forced the country to confront how much had gone unseen. As investigators confirmed the number of victims and the length of time Dahmer had been active, public reaction shifted from shock to disbelief. 17 victims, more than a decade, an apartment building in a major American city. People struggled to understand how crimes of that scale could remain hidden for so long. The question was no longer just what Dahmer had done, but how the system around him had failed repeatedly. Media coverage intensified. Details from the apartment search were released gradually, each new disclosure more disturbing than the last. Photographs, forensic findings, and timelines dominated headlines. News anchors spoke carefully, aware that the facts were almost too extreme to process. The story crossed borders, appearing in international coverage within days. For the families of the victims, exposure brought a different kind of pain. Many learned the fate of their loved ones through the news. Years of uncertainty ended not with relief, but with confirmation of unimaginable loss. Some families expressed anger at law enforcement. Others spoke of exhaustion, the emotional cost of waiting so long for answers that should have come sooner. As the investigation expanded, authorities began reconstructing Dahmer's past in detail. Former neighbors were interviewed. Past police encounters were reviewed. Missed warnings resurfaced one by one. Each revealed moment reinforced a pattern of oversight, dismissal, or delay. Incidents that once seemed minor now appeared critical. Psychologists were brought in to evaluate Dahmer and help explain his behavior. Their assessments did not focus on spectacle, but on understanding risk factors, control, and long-term violence. These evaluations would later play a major role in court, but even at this stage, they influenced how the public interpreted the case, not as random evil, but as sustained, unchecked danger. Public trust in institutions was shaken. Conversations shifted toward accountability. Why were victims returned to danger? Why were complaints ignored? Why were missing persons cases allowed to fade without follow-up? The Dahmer case became a reference point in discussions about policing, bias, and systemic blind spots. Law enforcement agencies across the country quietly began reviewing their own unsolved cases, aware that the exposure had set a precedent. Patterns mattered. Silence mattered. Delay mattered. What made this moment unique was its scale. The crimes were no longer confined to police reports or court files. They had entered public memory. The country was no longer watching a criminal case unfold. It was witnessing the collapse of an illusion that such violence could always be recognized in time. Jeffrey Dahmer was now fully exposed, not just as an individual offender, but as proof of what can happen when warning signs are seen, acknowledged, and still left unchallenged. The reckoning had begun. When Jeffrey Dahmer's case reached the courtroom, The focus shifted from discovery to responsibility. The facts were no longer in dispute. The evidence was overwhelming. The question now was not what happened, but how the law would define him. His defense team pursued an insanity argument, claiming Dahmer was mentally ill and unable to control his actions. Prosecutors disagreed. They argued that his behavior showed planning, awareness, and deliberate concealment, signs of someone who understood right from wrong and chose violence anyway. The trial became a national spectacle. Testimony detailed the crimes in controlled, methodical language, stripping away shock and replacing it with precision. Jurors heard from medical experts, law enforcement, and survivors' families. Dahmer himself spoke, calmly and without visible emotion. His lack of reaction disturbed many watching. It did not look like remorse. It looked like detachment. In the end, the jury rejected the insanity defense. Jeffrey Dahmer was found legally sane and fully responsible for his actions. He was sentenced to multiple life terms in prison, ensuring he would never be released. There was no dramatic outburst, no protest. The sentence landed quietly, heavy, final, and permanent. Inside prison, Dahmer became a figure of contradiction. Some inmates avoided him. Others confronted him. He reportedly expressed remorse in private conversations, but to the public, his words carried little weight. The damage was irreversible. For many, prison was not justice, it was containment. On November 28, 1994, that containment ended. While assigned to a work detail at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, Jeffrey Dahmer was attacked by a fellow inmate. He was beaten severely and later pronounced dead at a nearby hospital. He was 34 years old. His death was swift, violent, and unsentimental. There were no final statements, no redemption arc, just an abrupt ending to a life defined by harm. Public reaction was divided. Some saw it as inevitable. Others questioned whether it closed anything at all. What remained after his death was not relief, but reflection. The Dahmer case did not end with his sentence, and it did not end with his murder. It lived on in policy reviews, training reforms, and a lingering question that still echoes. How many chances were there to stop this earlier? This story is not about fascination with a killer. It is about recognizing patterns before they solidify into tragedy. It is about listening to warnings, even when they are uncomfortable. And it is about understanding that extreme violence does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appears calm, ordinary, and cooperative, until it is too late. Jeffrey Dahmer is gone. But the lessons from his case remain. And whether those lessons are remembered or ignored again is what truly determines how this story ends.